The Economist.
May 18th to May 24th, 2013.
Word for word. The articles from this week's edition of The Economist, including...
From the briefing section, Japan and Abenomics, once more with feeling.
From the Middle East and Africa section, Syria's civil war, the hard men prevail.
From the Science and Technology section, Psychiatry's new rules, Buy the book and more.
The world this week. Politics.
Nawaz Sharif's Pakistan Muslim League, N, won the Pakistani election, scooping 124 of the 272 contested seats and giving him his third term as Prime Minister. The better-than-expected result should mean that Mr Sharif will be able to rule without having to form a coalition. The outgoing PPP took second place ahead of the party of Imran Khan, a former cricketer. Election violence was high. Around 40 people were killed, including 11 killed by one bomb in Karachi.
Benigno Aquino of the Philippines sent a representative to apologize for the death of a Taiwanese fisherman who was shot by the Philippine Coast Guard in disputed waters. The president's move came after Taiwan recalled its envoy from Manila and said it would suspend hiring Filipino workers.
Joseph Estrada, a former Philippine president who was overthrown 12 years ago in a popular uprising, was elected mayor of Manila. Mr Estrada, a 76-year-old former film star, said he wanted to devote his final years to helping the poor. Mr Estrada was given a life sentence in 2007 for plunder, but freed after receiving a presidential pardon.
At least 50 Rohingya Muslims are feared drowned after their boats capsized off western Myanmar. The boats were evacuating people from the path of Cyclone Mahasan.
China became one of a number of countries to be granted permanent observer status on the Arctic Council. India, Italy, Japan, South Korea and Singapore were also admitted.
Turkey's government blamed Syria's for bombs which killed at least 50 people in Reyhanli, a Turkish town near the Syrian border. Meanwhile, a video showing a Syrian rebel apparently biting into the heart of a dead Syrian soldier stirred revulsion and embarrassment among sympathizers of the rebel cause.
A car bomb killed 3 civilians near a hospital in Libya's eastern capital Benghazi. A string of recent attacks have targeted the police and foreign diplomats, but this was the first apparently aimed at ordinary Libyans.
Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, a former president of Iran, and Esfandiar Mashai, an ally of the outgoing president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, sought to register their names as candidates for a presidential election on June 14th. Both oppose the ruling clerical establishment, which therefore may seek to block either or both of their candidacies.
Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan declared a state of emergency in Adamawa, Borno and Yobe, the 3 northeastern states that have suffered most grievously from the attacks of Boko Haram, a jihadist group which has killed more than 1,000 people in 4 years. The president admitted his forces had lost control of some parts of the country and gave them free rein in the 3 states.
A court in Guatemala sentenced José Efraín Ríos Montt, an 86-year-old former military dictator, to 80 years in prison for genocide and crimes against humanity suffered by Ixil Mayan Indians during a war against left-wing guerrillas. Days later, General Ríos Montt fainted while on his way to a hearing and was taken to a military hospital.
In the Canadian province of British Columbia, the ruling Provincial Liberal Party retained power, defeating the left-of-centre New Democrats. The result was a personal triumph for Christy Clark, the Premier, who backed proposed pipelines to carry heavy Alberta oil to Pacific ports.
Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro ordered 3,000 troops to patrol Caracas and other cities in a crackdown on escalating violent crime. The opposition worried that the plan is a means to allow the army to control municipal police forces.
After several years of deliberation, Cuba's government approved a scheme by a British company to build a $350 million golf resort, including apartments for sale to foreigners. The decision may herald a broader welcome for foreign investment from Raúl Castro's government.
The Internal Revenue Service was heavily criticised for singling out small government conservative groups for auditing. It was reported that in 2012, agents at the organisation's Cincinnati office had been selecting applications for charitable status from right-leaning campaign outfits for extra scrutiny. No amount of explaining why this might have been a sensible strategy made it sound any better. The agency's boss was fired.
A bad week for Barack Obama's administration got worse when it was revealed that his Justice Department had been going through telephone records at the Associated Press, searching for the source of a leak. Officials had obtained the details of more than 20 phone lines used by reporters and editors in New York, Washington, D.C. and Hartford, Connecticut.
Chicago's Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced that he would run for a second term in 2015 rather than seeking a higher office.
Kermit Gosnell, a doctor who performed illegal late-term abortions in Philadelphia, was given 3 life sentences. Both sides in America's abortion debate endorsed the verdict to make opposing points.
Russia arrested a purported American spy who was shown on television sporting a wig and allegedly carrying dark glasses, a compass and lots of cash. Ryan Fogel, a junior diplomat, was said to be trying to recruit a Russian security official dealing with the North Caucasus. Russia berated America.
Bulgaria's election produced an inconclusive result. The Gerb party of the former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov, who had resigned amid street protests in February, came first, but his win was so narrow that he may be unable to form a coalition.
Britain's fever over its membership of the European Union broke out again. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, tried to appease his Eurosceptic critics by publishing a draft bill to provide for an in-out referendum. The bill has little chance of passing, but some of his Conservative Party wanted it in the government's legislative programme to head off a growing threat from the populist UK Independence Party.
The World This Week. Business.
The Eurozone's GDP shrank for the 6th straight quarter, falling by 0.2% from January to March. Output fell in 9 of the currency union's 17 countries, including France, which dipped into recession for the second time in 4 years. Its biggest economy, Germany, grew by just 0.1%.
Britain's unemployment rate stood at 7.8% in the first 3 months of the year. The ranks of the jobless swelled by 15,000 compared with the previous quarter to 2.52 million.
The Bank of Israel cut its benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points to 1.5%. It also said it would buy $2.1 billion in foreign currency this year. The move follows rate cuts by central banks in Australia, South Korea, Poland, India and Hungary. The aim is to ease upward pressure on their currencies from unconventional monetary policies adopted in an effort to boost economic growth by their American, Japanese and Euro area counterparts.
In America, the producer price index slipped by 0.7% in April, the biggest decline since February 2010. Wholesale prices rose by 0.6% over the past 12 months.
The European Commission said that it had carried out unannounced inspections at big oil and biofuel companies, including Shell, BP, Norway's Statoil, as well as at Platts, the world's leading price reporting agency. The Commission fears the firms colluded to distort oil prices.
The Financial Reporting Council, which regulates accounting in Britain, launched 2 probes into KPMG following an insider trading scandal linked to the accounting firm's office in Los Angeles.
America's Commodity Futures Trading Commission has begun looking into the legality of 1 million swap transactions for energy and metals carried out over the past 2 years. The probe is the latest part of an effort to clamp down on previously unregulated over-the-counter derivatives trading.
Stock markets around the world continue to soar, with the MSCI World Index rising by 12.9% since the start of 2013. In America, the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 index reached record highs for the year. In Tokyo, the Topix 500 index leapt by 46% in local currency terms since the start of the year and by 68% over the past 12 months. The Stoxx Europe 600 index is at its highest in almost 5 years.
Google's share price exceeded $900 for the first time. The internet giant also tweaked some popular offerings, such as Google Maps, and unveiled a new music streaming service that will compete with the likes of Spotify and Pandora.
Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil company, auctioned off bonds worth $11 billion. The corporate debt issue was the biggest ever for an emerging market and the second biggest in the world this year, behind only Apple's record-breaking $17 billion bond sale in April.
Moody's downgraded the cooperative bank by 6 notches to junk status. The ratings agency said that the financial services arm of the cooperative group, Britain's biggest mutual company, might need a government bailout because of losses from bad debts and a merger in 2009 with Britannia Building Society. The bank denied it needed taxpayer support.
Tata Steel announced a $1.6 billion write-down, mainly as a result of the flagging fortunes of Chorus, a British steelmaker, which the Indian firm acquired in 2007 for £6.7 billion. That's $13 billion at the time.
Bloomberg scrambled to allay privacy concerns after it emerged that the financial information provider's reporters had access to privileged data about users of its ubiquitous terminals. Matthew Winkler, the editor-in-chief, apologised for what he called an inexcusable error and said such practices have ceased.
Verizon Wireless, America's biggest mobile service provider, announced an unexpectedly large dividend of $7 billion to its parent companies, Verizon Communications and Vodafone.
Daniel Loeb, an American activist hedge fund manager, bought a 6.5% stake in Sony for $1.1 billion. Mr. Loeb immediately urged the Japanese company to sell part of its lucrative entertainment arm, which sells music and makes the James Bond films, and focus on its core consumer electronics business.
Various British government agencies, including tax authorities, the police and intelligence services, met in London to discuss risks posed by Bitcoin, an unregulated virtual currency that they fear may be exploited by criminals and tax dodgers.
Leaders.
The Economist, May 18th to May 24th, 2013. In the Leaders section, Japan, Abe's master plan. Psychiatry, shrink-wrapping. Disaster in Syria, the least bad choice. And more.
Leaders.
Japan's master plan. Shinzo Abe has a vision of a prosperous and patriotic Japan. The economics looks better than the nationalism.
When Shinzo Abe resigned after just a year as Prime Minister in September 2007, he was derided by voters, broken by chronic illness and dogged by the ineptitude that has been the bane of so many recent Japanese leaders. Today, not yet 5 months into his second term, Mr. Abe seems to be a new man. He has put Japan on a regime of Abenomics, a mix of reflation, government spending and a growth strategy designed to jolt the economy out of the suspended animation that has gripped it for more than 2 decades. He has supercharged Japan's once fearsome bureaucracy to make government vigorous again. And with his own health revived, he has sketched out a programme of geopolitical rebranding and constitutional change that is meant to return Japan to what Mr. Abe thinks is its rightful place as a world power. Mr. Abe is electrifying a nation that had lost faith in its political class. Since he was elected, the stock market has risen by 55%. Consumer spending pushed up growth in the first quarter to an annualised 3.5%. Mr. Abe has an approval rating of over 70%, compared with around 30% at the end of his first term. His Liberal Democratic Party is poised to triumph in elections for the upper house of the Diet in July. With a majority in both chambers, he should be able to pass legislation freely. Pulling Japan out of its slump is a huge task. After 2 lost decades, the country's nominal GDP is the same as in 1991, while the Nikkei, even after the recent surge, is at barely a third of its peak. Japan's shrinking workforce is burdened by the cost of a growing number of the elderly. Its society has turned inwards, and its companies have lost their innovative edge. Mr. Abe is not the first politician to promise to revitalise his country. The land of the rising sun has seen more than its share of false dawns. And the new model Abe still has everything to prove. Yet if his plans are even half successful, he will surely be counted as a great Prime Minister. The reason for thinking this time might be different is China. Economic decline took on a new reality in Japan when China elbowed Japan aside in 2010 to become the world's second largest economy. As China has gained confidence, it has begun to throw its weight around in its coastal waters and with Japan directly over the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Earlier this month, China's official People's Daily even questioned Japanese sovereignty over Okinawa. Mr. Abe believes that meeting China's challenge means shaking off the apathy and passivity that have held Japan in thrall for so long. To explain the sheer ambition of his design, his people invoke the Meiji slogan Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the army. Only a wealthy Japan can afford to defend itself. Only if it can defend itself will it be able to stand up to China, and equally avoid becoming a vassal of its chief ally, the United States. Abenomics, with its fiscal stimulus and monetary easing, sounds as if it is an economic doctrine. In reality, it is at least as much about national security. Perhaps that is why Mr. Abe has governed with such urgency. Within his first weeks, he had announced extra government spending worth 10.3 trillion yen, about $100 billion. He has appointed a new governor of the Bank of Japan who has vowed to pump ever more money into the financial system. Insofar as this leads to a weaker yen, it will boost exports. If it banishes the spectre of deflation, it may also boost consumption. But printing money can achieve only so much, and with a gross debt of 240% of GDP, there is a limit to how much new government spending Japan can afford. To change the economy's long-run potential, therefore, Mr. Abe must carry through the third structural part of his plan. So far, he has set up 5 committees charged with instigating deep supply-side reforms. In February, he surprised even his supporters by signing Japan up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a regional trade agreement that promises to force open protected industries like farming. Nobody could object to a more prosperous Japan that would be a source of global demand. A patriotic Japan that had converted its self-defense forces into a standing army just like any other countries would add to the security of Northeast Asia. And yet, those who remember Mr. Abe's first disastrous term in office are left with 2 worries. The danger with the economy is that he goes soft, as he did before. Already there are whispers that if second quarter growth is poor, he will postpone the first of 2 consumption tax increases due in 2014 to 15 for fear of strangling the recovery. Yet a delay would leave Japan without a medium-term plan for limiting its debt and signal Mr. Abe's unwillingness to face up to tough choices. The fear is that he will bow to the lobbies that resist reform. Agriculture, pharmaceuticals and electricity are only some of the industries that need to be exposed to competition. Mr. Abe must not shrink from confronting them, even though that means taking on parts of his own party. The danger abroad is that he takes too hard a line, confusing national pride with a destructive and backward-looking nationalism. He belongs to a minority that has come to see Japan's post-war tutelage under America as a humiliation. His supporters insist he has learned that minimising Japan's wartime guilt is unacceptable. And yet he has already stirred up ill will with China and South Korea by asking whether Imperial Japan, for which his grandfather helped run occupied Manchuria, really was an aggressor, and by allowing his deputy to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, where high-ranking war criminals are honoured among Japan's war dead. Besides, Mr. Abe also seems to want more than the standing army Japan now needs and deserves. The talk is of an overhaul to the liberal parts of the Constitution, unchanged since it was handed down by America in 1947. Mr. Abe risks feeding regional rivalries which could weaken economic growth by threatening trade. Mr. Abe is right to want to awaken Japan. After the upper house elections, he will have a real chance to do so. The way to restore Japan is to focus on reinvigorating the economy, not to end up in a needless war with China.
Leaders.
Psychiatry. Shrink wrapping. A single book has come to dominate psychiatry. That is dangerous.
The human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. It contains 100 billion nerve cells. Considering how complex that is, it goes wrong remarkably rarely. But go wrong it sometimes does. Which is why, since 1952, the American Psychiatric Association has published its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. This book, the newest version of which will hit the shops on May 22nd, contains the association's thinking on what constitutes a disorder of the mind. It is consulted not only by psychiatrists, but also by insurance firms, drug companies, and anxious patients and parents, not only in America, but around the world. It has become the industry standard for defining what is and is not a mental illness, and thus who gets treated and who pays for treatment. No other major branch of medicine has such a single text, with so much power over people's lives, and that is worrying. Because in no other branch of medicine is the scientific reality underpinning the pronouncements of doctors so uncertain. This uncertainty flows from a profound ignorance about how brains actually work. Neuroscientists understand how nerve cells work. They also know which bits of the brain deal with vision, locomotion, language, memory, and such like. But between these two anatomical levels, all is darkness. Psychiatrists have thus had to use behavior patterns as proxies for underlying problems. And what constitutes a pattern is too often a matter of opinion rather than a statistically rigorous fact. It is this desire to find and classify patterns which gives the DSM its power. By naming things it gives shape to the fledgling science. That is not a bad thing in principle, but in practice it has gone too far. The main criticisms are that it medicalizes normal behavior and that the strict categories of mental illness it creates are increasingly at odds with what research suggests is actually going on in the brain. Both criticisms are ultimately about names. The DSM gives names like disruptive mood dysregulation disorder to temper tantrums in children and binge-eating disorder to those who tend to overeat. If these were mere labels, perhaps it would not matter, though in the area of mental health even a label can be damning. But diagnosis frequently leads to prescription, and lots of pills are thus being popped by people whose need to take them is, to say the least, questionable. The way the DSM classifies those who unquestionably are ill is also under attack. Schizophrenia, major depression, and some forms of autism are disabling conditions that have long been considered separate diseases. But modern techniques of gene analysis and brain scanning are leading some researchers to wonder whether they really can be distinguished in the way that, say, various forms of leukemia can be differentiated. For their biological underpinnings seem to overlap. Without a proper diagnosis, proper treatment is hard. Veneration of the DSM is also harmful in research. Thomas Insel, the head of America's National Institute of Mental Health, has publicly encouraged scientists not to be constrained by its approach, lest it prevent them finding diagnoses and treatments. In terms of diagnosis, A few psychiatrists, including those who conducted the genetics and brain scanning studies, now publicly point to the DSM's deficiencies. Yet the DSM's definitions and certainties are too deeply ingrained for this criticism to have hit home. The full consequences of that will not be obvious for a long time. But the current over-reliance on one point of view in this extremely uncertain science is healthy neither for psychiatry nor for those it treats.
Leaders.
Disaster in Syria. The least bad choice. Step up the campaign for a diplomatic solution and back the rebels more strongly.
Nothing in recent years epitomises foreign policy's damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma more bloodily than Syria. All options for the West, and especially Barack Obama, are fraught. Do nothing, and the civil war could become twice as murderous, spill into fragile neighbouring states, and even result in victory for the loathsome regime of Bashar Assad. Do everything, from arming the rebels to attacking Mr. Assad's forces directly, at least from the air, and America could be dragged into a quagmire reminiscent of Afghanistan or Iraq. Yet doing something hesitantly in between, by helping the rebels a bit, but not enough to bring down Mr. Assad, may be the worst of all worlds. It risks emboldening potential waverers around Mr. Assad to cling on at the same time as prolonging the catastrophe, while extremists come to dominate both sides on the battlefield. This middle course is the one that Mr. Obama has chosen. The Economist has long argued for setting up a no-fly zone on humanitarian grounds. That is an imperfect solution, but the cost of doing nothing is ever more evident for both Syria and the region. The level of savagery means that even Mr. Obama cannot look away, but it also makes it harder for him to intervene. If they will not set up a no-fly zone, America and its allies should at least arm their chosen rebels overtly, so as to speed up the removal of Mr. Assad, yet also organize a peace conference with all the main parties, including Russia. The situation inside Syria has gone from dire to catastrophic. In the past few weeks, Mr. Assad's forces have regained the initiative in some areas. Part of the president's plan is for an iron axis to run from Damascus northwest through the pivotal city of Homs and onto the coastal and mountain heartland of the Alawites, his minority sect. Hence the beginning of a sectarian cleansing of Sunnis from some coastal towns. If the regime manages to entrench itself in that zone, it may be able to strike back at the rest of the country, where the rebels still have the upper hand. At the same time, the regime's allies, Iran and Hezbollah, the Shia party come militia from neighbouring Lebanon, are training and arming Mr. Assad's Alawite militias. Russia may bolster his air defences. Britain and France are keen to tip the balance back towards the rebels, but are locked into a European Union embargo against providing them with arms. Mr. Obama, meanwhile, seems determined not to let the United States be sucked in, even to the limited extent of supplying American weapons. Given recent failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is understandable, but it is also wrong. Syria used to be a tolerant place, but the longer the conflict drags on, the more likely it is that the nastiest of the rebels, who owe allegiance to al-Qaeda, will come to the fore. Should Mr. Assad's regime fall, the extremists might even precipitate a second civil war. That would threaten an outright al-Qaeda victory, which would be just as bad as the stalemate now favouring Mr. Assad. The West's minimalist approach is strengthening the extremists, because Saudi Arabia and Qatar, helped by the CIA no less, are funneling money to the most radical groups. Meanwhile, the more moderate rebels are stuck in a chicken and egg situation. The longer the West vacillates, the weaker the moderates become, and the stronger the extremist rebels, the higher the regime's hopes of survival. The argument against arming the rebels, that doing so would pour fuel on the fire, does not stand up. Arms are bound to intensify the violence in the short run, but the country is already in flames, and the regime is doing most of the burning. The most moderate rebels need help. Europe should therefore lift its embargo, and Mr. Obama climb off the fence. Support for the rebels can improve the chances of usefully holding the conference that Russia and America recently agreed to in principle.
Every sort of pressure, military included, must be exerted on Mr. Assad in the run-up to the talks, just as the rebels should be persuaded to drop their insistence that he must vanish before negotiations can begin. The Russians have hitherto sounded happy to let Syria stew, in the hope that America will look impotent and incompetent. But Vladimir Putin does not want Islamic fundamentalists to end up running Syria, nor does he like the idea of chemical weapons on the loose. Negotiations should start in earnest as soon as possible, probably in Geneva, with a view to agreeing on a ceasefire, a transitional government, and an internationally overseen election. That would still be the best way to save what is left of Syria from utter ruin.